I'm glad to be here. And the reason I wanted to have a discussion is because sustainability is something that we all need to be involved in and think about in very serious ways. And as an educator and researcher, I have been for a long time involved in what we understand as sustainable food systems, and why is it that it is something that everyone can be involved in and is also impacted or affected by it, irrespective of whether we think about it or not. So today, I just briefly want to run through, in some sense, the history of food systems and what is the current state and how can we change it. So to do that, I'll just share my screen. Yeah. So what I want to discuss with all of you is a brief history of agriculture. So think about agriculture as probably one of the oldest relationships we have with land, because every time we eat anything, we are probably enjoying the literal fruit of thousands of years of experimentation and knowledge that has gone into figuring out what is it that is edible. I mean, if you go into a forest or you go into any of these nature trails, and if you for a second try and remove everything you know from your memory about what is edible, just think about it, how difficult it would be for us to actually even figure out. So how do we know that bitter gourd is edible, or that yams need to be boiled to remove their itchiness, or that some food can be eaten raw, some food has to be cooked in specific ways? So this is all knowledge that has been passed on and refined and worked on and experimented with for thousands of years. So, and that is obviously not something that goes on in our mind every time we eat. So think about it, like if we were to just dwell on our last meal, you could ask yourself, what did we eat, where did we buy the food from, if we cooked it, where did we buy the raw ingredients from, have we grown any of the ingredients we used, or do we know how to grow any of the ingredients we use? So if you systematically go through all these questions, you will realize that most of us know very little about the steps that are required to produce, process, transport, and prepare the food we eat. So, and how has all of this come to be? So for this, if we really take a leap back into history, um, what is said is that our ancestors roamed in the open savannas, which are like these grasslands in Central Africa, maybe like thousands and thousands and millions of years back. So, and that is where their environment and biology came together such that they were widely omnivorous. So, in fact, researchers believe that the quest and search for food played a big part in tool making, because if you see that our ancestors were not necessarily faster or stronger than many of the other animals in their environment, so they had to really come up with very clever ways to be able to access the food. And because of that, as they started hunting, storing, catching food, it is said that the development of brains itself in part was because of their ways of getting food. And this was sort of a positive feedback cycle where access to better food led them to develop like more complex brains, and more complex brains actually contributed to even more tool making exercises. And slowly, I mean, the turning point was the control of fire, which allowed humans to access a wide variety of food and unlocking new sources of nutrition. So if you think about it, like there are so many things that we actually cook, and that cooking already does, like, let's say 50% of the work that our stomach would otherwise have to do. And you compare that with other animals, like for example, gorillas spend as much as 16 hours maybe foraging for food. So That much amount of time was left for us to explore, create, and build newer tools, start coming together, build societies, and also allowed us to collaborate in novel ways to start dividing labor and sharing resources. And the moment we start doing that, we realize that we are now coming and, closer to building what were the earliest civilizations. So, and that is what is generally believed, that around 11,000 BC, people began this, gradual transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle towards cultivating crops and raising animals for food. So this shift for agriculture is believed to have occurred independently in several parts of the world, like northern China, Central America, what is called the Fertile Crescent along the region in the Middle East. And by 6000 BC, most of the farm animals that we are familiar with today had been domesticated. In fact, we have domesticated, the last animal to be domesticated was the European hare, about maybe 5,000, 6,000 years ago, and we haven't domesticated any animal since. So now the question is that, okay, why did this turn happen from hunter gatherer to agriculture and settling down? So um, one another way to ask this question is that if you really think about it, hunting and gathering actually involved less work, because you would make go and gather the food source and use it up, and then once it was over, you just move to another place, and you, by this act of foraging and hunting, hunter gatherers actually had access to more diverse kinds of food as opposed to those who were farming. So the question being that why was the shift made? So one thing to understand is that it was not an overnight shift. It's not like one night they were hunter gatherers and the next day they decided to farm. These were gradual changes, and partially it may have happened because of changes in the climate that made it too risky to rely on wild food sources. And as people, I mean, as population also increased, they could have been the demands for food may have been more than what was available in the wild, and farming in that sense did offer more food per acre, even if it required more time and energy. So also overhunting, it is said that had pushed a lot of megafauna to extinction. And at the same time, with the sophistication in experiments and tool making, where they had already started domesticating some seeds, gradually it may have made farming a more viable lifestyle. So this is how this shift has actually happened over like thousands of years, where gradually our ancestors started settling down. So the point here is that agriculture is often portrayed as this progression, and but that's exactly the point, that we don't really know. I mean, to think of it as a progression is not the right way, because it was more of a change, a gradual change that was brought about through different kinds of environmental factors. So in the millennia that followed the initial stages of farming, a wide variety of grains, fruits, vegetables, tubers were domesticated, and methods. So the methods of preservation, cooking also started developing along with the ways of growing these food items. So large scale cultivation also then led to trade and commerce in a big way, because now you needed labor. And in fact, the darker practices of forced labor and slavery on farmlands initially started because of these kind of large plantation drives. So I will be sharing all these slides in a link later, and you can free to read more about the history of agriculture. Now we move towards the idea of food as technology. So what happened is that you know the we don't often think of agriculture as technology. So when I say that food is a technology, one has to understand that there was a lot of experimentation, manipulation that was involved in turning the wild varieties of food into something that was edible, more nutritious, and easily grown. So, in fact, in some places, researchers have often said that farmers were probably the first scientists, because they really had to rely on very careful kinds of observation and control to be able to reproduce the varieties that they saw, and to be able to care for the plants that they were growing. So three domesticated plants in particular that probably is responsible for nearly 70 to 80% of the agriculture today is wheat, rice, and maize. And they laid the foundation for civilization and continue to do so even today. So, it's an interesting thing, because it is often said that, humans domesticated all these varieties. That's how we have been saying it till now, right? But if you think about it, I mean, their domestication and our domestication went hand in hand. So it's a fair question to ask, who domesticated whom? So, mm, it was our continued reliance on these primarily 3 to 4 crops actually led to many of the lifestyle changes and work patterns that, are continue to reflect today. So just to give an example, corn is one of the most consumed food products in the world today. And you will find corn derivatives or some part of the corn in almost any processed food that you eat. So, in the form of either corn syrup, corn starch, corn based animal feed, livestock feed, biofuel. So, you know, I mean, there are people who have said we eat corn, we drive corn, we sleep corn, and that is the extent to which corn has become synonymous with human society. So now corn has a very interesting history, because corn kernels were derived from maize and is thought to have been first domesticated by native people in southern Mexico almost 10,000 years ago. So the maize consumed today is actually uh, outcome of a series of random genetic mutations which were carefully selected by the people who were growing the corn. And if you look at it, that the wild grass, basically maize is a kind of grass, rice, wheat, maize, these are all types of grasses. And the original wild versions of these crops look very different from what we grow today. So, for example, this particular maize variety was not very edible. It was very hard. The cob was very hard. It was very small and had very few kernels, which were encased in a tough, casing or cover. So, but through a lot of experimentation and observation and selection, early farmers began to propagate what they felt were desirable traits, such as having more ears of the corn on a single plant, having softer casing, and as a result, now after several thousand years, maize today cannot grow on its own. It is completely dependent on human intervention or human. It has to be manually pollinated, or today it is done by machines. But maize cannot grow on its own in the wild. So that is the extent to which we have modified the growth of a plant. So, and not only that, I mean, the early farmers also created many varieties which are called as land races. So, thousands of varieties of corns were, selectively developed and bred. And these have been, in use since 1500 AD. And there are more than 500 varieties that have been recorded in the Americas alone. So that is the kind of legacy that farmers have had. Similarly, for rice, the domestication of rice and wheat was also a story that unfolded over thousands of years, where the properties were slowly manipulated such that rice now, again today, lost its ability to survive in flood waters after a while, and is very much dependent on human intervention for transplanting. So the idea being, I mean, the larger story here is that growing food involved these kind of slow changes and a very intimate knowledge of the environment and the land. So, but what has happened now? I mean, what all this knowledge, all this technology, and practices developed have took a turn for the worse in the mid. I mean, and this is a story that has unfolded only in the last 100 years or so, with the incoming of what we know as industrial agriculture. So in activist Vandana Shiva in fact has said in one of the conferences that we are still eating the leftovers of World War II. So what does that mean? That means that and we'll come to that in a minute, but modern agriculture is basically this huge operation of monoculture that seems to be efficient from an economical perspective, but the real cost of agricultural practices in terms of the health of ecological effects is not accounted for. So and partially why this sort of came into being was because after World War II, there was a surplus of ammonium nitrate, that is an ingredient in making explosives, that was repurposed to become nitrogen fertilizers for plants. So already before World War II, societies had started moving towards having these large plantations and monocrops, which had started creating this demand for fertilizers. So in fact, one of the islands of South America is a migrating spot for birds who would leave a lot of their excrement, which is very rich in nitrogen. So it's called guano. And there were countries that fought with each other over control of that island, which was known as the Guano Wars, because for the to access the nitrogen rich residue, which would be converted into fertilizer. So what happened in some sense, I mean, this was the fact that now this could be synthetically made, sort of really changed. It was a game changer at that point in time. And so the chemical fertilizer industry was basically a product of the government's effort to convert its war machines into peacetime purposes. So and what did that then subsequently lead to is this increased specialization, where so earlier if a farmer was growing like 10, 12 varieties of crops, it became a feedback loop where, because you're using, now you have large tracts of land, you have to grow one kind of crop. And these are then can be applied uniformly with fertilizers and pesticides and so on. So everything became very specialized, and the kind of integrated knowledge that existed earlier slowly started eroding away. And because when you remove diversity, the work also becomes more repetitive and replaceable. There has been an increased mechanization of many of the farm activities, and when we are doing that, we are also then actually eroding the associated knowledge, because now farmers are not able to pass on what they were doing during their time to the next generation. And as I mentioned before, I mean, all of this is hinging on the use of large amounts of synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides, which are a product of ammonium nitrate, which are in some sense a byproduct of fossil fuels. So these reliance on chemicals is also basically a reliance on fossil fuels. So I mean, if you are following the current news, you would see that because of the global tensions, the cost of fertilizers now has really skyrocketed, and farmers are protesting because they're not able to buy fertilizers at the price promised. And India also pays huge amounts in subsidies for these fertilizers. So apart from being a you know an ecological problem, it is also a great economic burden for any country to continue using fertilizers at this rate. And again, like I mentioned before, uh, so land was not being seen anymore as a system. It just became a financial asset or real estate, which was just supporting these agricultural commodities. So the entire connection, I mean, like when we're talking about history, I mean, the understanding the land, the plants, the soil, the people, the biodiversity as an integrated whole was completely lost, and it all became compartmentalized. So and this kind of a feedback loop between the use of fertilizers, larger lands, larger machines, and the technology to support what we call as economies of scale started taking root. So even now, then in a country like India, where almost 80% of the farmers are small and marginal farmers, which means they have less than zero point 0.2 acres of land, perhaps. This is a move that is really hurting them. And by now, you would realize that this form of industrial agriculture is obviously hurting the people, but it is also hurting the ecosystem in very dangerous ways, because it is really pushing the boundaries for what is understood as a safe operating space for humanity. So these are 9 planetary boundaries which were identified, and it studies show that agriculture is actually responsible for pushing almost 5 out of these 9 parameters beyond the safety zone. So the biggest of this is obviously climate change, where the emissions from the entire food system, from production to consumption to the land use, is contributing to almost a quarter of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And so one has to really think about alternatives as to what is our imagination of agriculture. Does it have to be so destructive? Does it have to be these form of monoculture lands, which is leading to large scale deforestation and so on? With obviously monocultures, uh, agriculture has played a major role in shifting the what is known as the biosphere integrity and the diversity of the plants and animals dependent on a particular ecosystem. So already declining biodiversity has resulted in an increasing frequency and virulence of pest attacks. So there has been, like in India, a 500% increase in pest incidences for rice from 1965 to 2009. And the number of rice pests increased from 5 to 15 in the same period. So because when we are like disturbing the entire food web, um, uh, you we no longer have a relationship, a good and healthy pest predator relationship. Similarly, the between 2000 and 2010, agriculture is estimated to have driven 80% of the deforestation worldwide. And in India itself, the extent of degraded land has now reached about 12 crore hectares, or 38% of our total geographical area. So these kind of industrial agricultural processes, which was more popularly known as green revolution in India, and its associated policies, sort of did not pay enough attention to this microbial activity, organic matter, and the moisture holding capacity of the soil. So by treating all of these as individual entities which can be manipulated, has led to a really um, skewed kind of a system, which is harming and leading to the lands getting degraded in very serious ways. And it does not end there, because when we are really turning and affecting the moisture retention capacity of the land, and using so much of fertilizer, we now need a lot of water to be able to irrigate those soil, because basically the soil is not holding any water. So almost 84% of the fresh water is used in agriculture, and the figure is as high as 90% in arid regions. uh, According to like more recent reports, 54% of India is extremely water stressed because of the water usage in agriculture specifically. So, and and the main thing to understand is that even if whether we agree to it, or we are aware of it or not, the earth is a closed system. So when we are extracting this amount of fertilizer and using it so heavily on the land, it is impacting something else. In this sense, in this case, it is the global cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus around the globe. So what is happening is that applying all those fertilizers on the land, of which the plant is maybe able to absorb maybe 30 to 40%, and the rest just goes as runoff into the oceans and the water bodies, which actually don't need, because what that leads to are these excessive algae blooms, and that sucks up the oxygen in the water and leads to what are known as these dead zones, where nothing, no other life can exist. And slowly this is then interfering with the with the ocean level food web as well, because of which the oceans are then warming up, and really adversely impacting the life in the sea. So we are, in that sense, we are not only just impacting the land, but the water also is really getting affected by these kind of nitrogen and phosphorus flows. So, so like I was saying, that this is the kind of ocean, what is known as ocean acidification, because after a while, I mean, the water, then the oceans actually start becoming a source of carbon dioxide emissions. So with all of these put together, what we understand is that agriculture is the major driver of five of these planetary boundaries, and we still don't know actually how it is impacting the other parameters. So the study that actually did try and understand how agriculture is impacting these boundaries said that nothing less than a radically transformed system will be required, with numerous changes made to all aspects of production. So, coming to the end of this talk, which was basically to try and lay out the issues that we have to really engage with if we want to think about a transformative food systems, um, is to for us to at least start becoming very reflective about what is it and where is it we source our food from. So if you were to, for instance, draw a list of foods that you have eaten in a week and categorize under them under different themes like raw, cooked, processed, grains, vegetables. So a single food item might come under many of these themes together. You might be able to see a pattern. Like, is it that 70% of your diet is more or less just grains? Or do you also have access to fruits and vegetables? Is more of the food that you eat processed? So that itself will give us an idea about how mindful we are regarding our eating patterns. And the second part is that the price that we pay for food is also a reflection of the ecological cost of growing that food. But we often don't know it, and very often probably don't even pay for it, because think about it. If you were to decide the price of individual food items, how would you calculate the cost? And try doing it maybe for a single food item, and jot down what are the parameters that you would consider and see, does it really add up? So if I'm paying, let's say, 20 rupees or 30 rupees for a kg of potatoes, mm, if you were to start tracing where was this potato originally grown, and how much would it take to actually transport, how much did it take to grow, what is it that it displaced, how much did the farmer get, who, adding all the labor, you would see that much of it is actually externalized. That is, it is sort of not being accounted for. And if it is not being accounted for, who is actually paying for it? So these are questions that we have to be able to ask as consumers. And a third thing that one could start with would be to maybe just talk to older generations and ask them what kind of food they ate and how different it is from the diet that is available to us nowadays. And even there, we would realize that actually we are losing out on a lot of diversity that was available back then. And our that monoculture is sort of also visible in our own diets, and we don't even clearly understand what impacts it could have on our own health, and subsequently obviously the health of organisms and the systems around us. So these are other links that can help you read more if you're interested, and I'm happy to have a discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Deborah. Actually, this was really great presentation and
Thank you.
great session for us. And I really like the two concepts, I would say, from the presentation. The first being 4-hour week for our ancestors. So that was really something new, innovative. And the second, the farmers as early scientists. So they were the first one to
Absolutely.
think about and invent something. So I think that is really, we should appreciate these things as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
At the start of your presentation, we discuss about our ancestors in the early times. They were omnivores and in savannas or at that point. So in many of the literature, in many of the books, so it is said that it's not clear whether our ancestors were omnivores or carnivores or vegetarians. So because they had given the reasons of the physical, the structures, the teeth, maybe the intestines and all the
Right.
reasons. So would you like to explain it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so for one is that there it could be possible that within larger cultures there may be some particular tribes who did not, let's say, hunt and were more or less dependent on food from the plants and fruits and other kind of sources without having the need to hunt. So I would say, and there are, again, I mean, there are evidences basically based on the kind of hunting equipments that have been found, other kinds of tools which seem to be very closely connected to the killing of animals, and obviously then probably eating them. So I would, so the if you would see, the term I used was opportunistic. So it is not the question here is that what was available to maybe separate cultures in their immediate environment that they were trying to leverage. So if you were to think about, let's say, the tundra regions where vegetation would be very sparse, and actually the most obvious source of food would be smaller animals, there the situation would have demanded that they hunt. But in maybe very fertile regions in the tropicals, a primarily fruit source would work very well, because those are very abundant in all kinds of fruits. So I would say, more than whether um, you know our ancestors were omnivores or carnivores or purely dependent on plant-based diets. It is more to understand how were they sort of engaging with their immediate environments, and also competing with other animals who were biologically well adapted. So you can't climb trees as fast, or you can't hunt as fast. So what is it that you do? You try to develop tools, you try to band together, form these communal groups so that you can get access to a food source. And that is the point that I was trying to stress. So yes.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I also agree with that. The tools are really required, because even nowadays, if you go to the national parks, so it's really scary, because a lot
Yes.
of predators are there, and how to protect
Yes.
ourselves. So yeah,
Yes.
so, tool would be the first thing that humans
Yes.
had to develop during this
Correct.
transition.
Correct.
Yeah. And as we are talking about the transition, so I feel for India, the Green Revolution was one of the transition point, the inflection point. So many times it is said Green Revolution is good, and many times it is the ill effects of that. So would you like to discuss throw some light on this topic as well?
Yeah, I mean, it is again a very complex and a long topic, but again, to briefly, it would not be fair to sort of bracket it as a necessarily bad thing that happened, or a good thing that happened, because what we are talking about here is essentially a time frame. So at that point, I mean, so when there was this, if you look at also the socio-economic kind of situation that India was in, where there were droughts before, and there were memories of the famine. So there was this anxiety around being having to become self-sufficient in food production, for which these practices, sort of green revolution oriented practices, seem to offer a quick solution within a time frame of, let's say, 5 to 10 years, which is when India sort of was able to actually become self-sufficient and even started exporting food grains at that point. So it could, but the larger, the long term effects of it were probably not even understood very well, and that those things became apparent only 20-30 years down the line. But what happened is, by then a certain inertia also sets in with respect to the practices, and the systems start developing such that they keep reinforcing. So because you start using fertilizers, you start using monocultures, there are policies which developed around providing subsidies for certain kind of practices, providing this minimum support price for only certain kinds of grains. So now we are enmeshed in this like system from which it is very difficult to change, unless there is a strong push from the policy, a strong from the consumer side, us demanding a variety of food, because we can't ask the farmer to grow 20 different types of grains if we only eat one kind of rice. So there are a lot of things that have to change simultaneously for the shift to happen. And so the question being that green revolution served a certain kind of, let's say, function and purpose, but now it is time for a different kind of system to set in. So
Right. Yeah, thanks, Miss. As we are discussing in the first session, the history of agriculture. Yeah, so I guess we have covered most of the points. Yeah, and from Green Revolution also. So, what were the good points? What are the beneficial points we should learn from that? And what were the mistakes?
right.
How we can correct that through the systemic viewpoint? I think that is what
Right.
this session also meant to be, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So
Thanks.
thank you so
Thanks a
much
lot.
for having me. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Deborah. It
Okay.
was a great discussing with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.